This is a topic that, most people have some type of knowledge, and if not some type of knowledge, always some type of opinion about. So it tends to generate a lot of interesting conversation, and hopefully it'll do so today. What I'll be talking about today is essentially what I've called controlling the movement, right? This dynamic between police and activist interaction in Greater St. Louis, particularly. This presentation will focus on this critical period, 1 year after the death of Michael Brown, right? So all events talked about today occur over the month of August 2015. So first, a little bit of background just to kind of paint a picture of the Greater St. Louis region in which Ferguson sits. Ferguson is in St. Louis County. So starting this column, about 1 million people. Primarily majority white, although great disparities. There are 90 municipalities in St. Louis County. It's a separate entity from St. Louis City. From a governance perspective, the city is not a part of the county. And so you see here just the racial demographics and also a breakdown of poverty. Crime rates, which I would love to report on, are a bit more difficult to get your hands on because it is a kind of agglomeration of 90 different municipalities, which means 90 different towns from which to gather these statistics. And many, only recently are people interested in the county as a whole to begin to look at that data. But also, so St. Louis City, about 300,000, one of the largest cities in the United States. There are only 200 cities over 200,000. St. Louis ranks towards the top. Racial demographics, a little bit different than the county. There's much more of an even split between white and black, but of note, and I won't really talk about it today, but it's somewhat important, this very small population of what we would otherwise label as other, right? Your kind of racial mediators on the spectrum, right? So very small Asian population, very small Hispanic population in the region at large. And why that matters, just to foreshadow a little bit, is because of these ideas, very stark racial boundaries and that pertain to the issue. So what exactly is the issue with regards to the movement? A lot of it started around arrest-related deaths, and so I wanted to give you just a profile of arrest-related deaths since 2012 being kind of the modern-day resurgence of attention paid to deaths that occur in the context of policing, right? So this is since the time of Trayvon Martin, 2012. So 34 in total in the region, 23 in St. Louis City, 11 in St. Louis County, primarily black, primarily firearm deaths, but also vehicular deaths, and one by taser. Since August 2014, so this is since Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, there have been 13, and actually this figure has changed since this was done, so this is as of the end of October. But 13 in the region, almost evenly split within the city and the county, whereas previously, for the past few years, they've been almost around double in the city as opposed to the county. Right, so 7 in St. Louis City since last year, 6 in St. Louis County, almost all black, only 1 Hispanic, primarily firearm deaths. Oh, sorry, I keep closing the drawer that has the, the keyboard. And so what exactly is the nature of protests then? And particularly protests since August 2014. After the shooting of Michael Brown and people took to the street, these were literally what it sounds like, people taking to the street. But what's occurred in the meantime is organization, right? And the upstart of many organizations that essentially did not exist a year ago. Why are organizations important? Because there's this, kind of strong, at least conceptual relationship that we have between organizations and movements. And if I'm speaking a little bit too quickly, please let me know. I tend to talk a little bit fast. But you now have organizations that have sprouted up in response to the issue, right? The issue being arrest-related deaths, such as Hands Up United, Millennial Activists United, Organization for Black Struggle, Socialist Alternative now has a thriving chapter. Lost Voices, this is a group of youth and young adults in the region, right? And what exactly do these organizations do? Well, they conduct almost daily actions and protests in the region, right? Protest has not, after the riots, when the non-indictment occurred, after some of the confrontations in February, in March, et cetera, protest has not stopped, even though it is not covered as widely by media, right? It didn't stop after August and then resurge, around the non-indictment, and then stop again and then resurge a little bit more for the 1-year anniversary. Almost daily, these various protest actions are being held. And what exactly are they around? Primarily justice for those killed by police, but also these kind of bigger pictures surrounding racial and economic inequality, right? Or demands for racial and economic equality, opportunities of jobs, putting money where politicians say they're going to put money to better the community, especially promises made post-August 2014 with the influx of money into the region to improve the quality of life, and leading into this other main issue about crime and the quality of life in the region. And so the focus here, there's this kind of question as to why activism continues in the region. What is it that leads people to protest and demonstrate, right, and keep rising up on an almost daily basis 1 year later? And so it can't possibly be, I'll just kind of foreshadow and tell you what it's not. It's not that people are dying at the hands of police every day, right? In actuality, a little bit about arrest-related deaths, they're rare events. Now, some sociologists argue from a focus, that rare events happen all the time, and perhaps, we should stop looking at the rarity of one occasion and look more broadly, right, as to what it is about this broad number of rare things that happen. But, what is it that leads activism to continue? And particularly in spite of heightened repression and surveillance by police. And I'll talk a little bit about that, well, a lot about that, but really focusing on this, sub-question, how does the state attempt to gain control of and suppress dissent in the region? And then how do activists manage or circumvent state control, right? How do they avoid being repressed, right? How do they keep coming back? And so this third question really leads back into this broader, why does it continue? And so to make this point, I'm actually going to, I'll talk about all observed events over the course of the month, but I'm really going to focus on this one particular day in August on the 19th that is kind of like it's the rare event of protest days, and for a number of reasons, which you'll understand in a second. But to sum it up, this is essentially started as a memorializing event for Kajim Powell, who was killed shortly after Michael Brown the year before, in August 2014, and another instance of an arrest-related death, right? So a death occurring in the course of police interaction while trying to make an arrest or stop of Mansour Balbay. And this one particular day, and just to give you a little bit more explanation why I'm using it, it's to both illustrate the variation in actions and to illustrate this, variation in these temporal or interactional elements of protest, right? So what is it about the time and place that these things occur, and what is it about the actors involved? And so just a little bit before I this is a story that occurs in pictures. Some of the pictures are noticeably not the best pictures. None of these are media pictures. These are all taken personally, largely from an iPhone, and for various reasons, once you see kind of what's going on, why I'm just on the move and can't take out other things for better pictures. But the second is, sometimes I purposefully chose the pictures that were not the best, essentially because of anonymity, right? So if there was a picture that would clearly show who exactly is in it, you could pinpoint, and a lot of these activists have been subject to targeting both by police and their peers, et cetera, then I chose something else that would still illustrate the point, and I can talk you through it, but just to warn you, it may not be the best picture. So at 11 a.m. in the morning, there was a balloon release, and it's the 1-year anniversary of Kajim Powell, who was killed at the Six Star Market in St. Louis. And so this action occurred at Kiener Plaza. It was a commemorative action. The attorney spoke, the family spoke, the young man who filmed the killing on video spoke, and some demands were made, very clear. They wanted the names of the officers responsible for the killing released. They wanted those officers responsible, once named, to be fired. They wanted the circuit attorney, Jennifer Joyce, to resign for not taking proper action on the issue. And police did attend this. They showed up, kind of looked. Kiener Plaza is actually, from a surveillance perspective, ideally located for police surveillance because you walk down to the plaza, so it's easy to just come to the top and look without having to get out or interact. They showed up and here did nothing. At 11:30, it turned into a march, and so this picture used with permission, but it turned into a march down to the county courthouse, right? While down at the courthouse, and this is attended at the time by maybe about 100 people, word comes over the police radio that there's been another officer-involved shooting. So while here protesting and demanding justice for one the prior year, another occurs. And so illustrating that why this is kind of the unicorn of days in terms of the kind of how the events unfold. So police performed surveillance. There were no arrests made. Their radios were up. People were able to hear word of this new shooting. People packed up and moved to the site of the new shooting. So I put the times here, and you'll notice there's a bit of a time delay because I cannot navigate. So 1:25 p.m., little bit of a delay. This is the corner of Page and Walton. The killing of Mansour Balbay was actually in the gangway between this house here. This is the tape. They taped off the block, but also part of the property across the street. The situation is tense, as you see some, talking to the police, the family not needing to be notified, right? So we get this kind of dramatic idea of how exactly notification happens, right? Something happens, then police, go and notify the family. In this situation, that wasn't necessary. The family was pretty much on scene as it was occurring. So in addition to, the crowd being tense and already it being a tough situation, at this point, when things first happen, the stories aren't accurate. The reports that 3 people had actually been shot. One, was allegedly a kid, and, people are passing around information. Some of it's often wrong, which, kind of leads things to already be tense. But at this point, it's still rather calm, and you'll see calm is comparative to what ends up happening. There were multiple cop units already on scene to monitor and investigate. There are now more on scene that kind of came with the crowd of protesters, right? So those that were surveilling activists at the courthouse are now being transplanted to Page and Walton. Page and Walton is actually located, it's not North St. Louis City, and it's kind of on the border, but it's in West City, in this somewhat gentrifying area, but still hasn't come as far as some perhaps would like it to be. This is actually, if any of you listen to old rap and remember Nelly, this is actually around the corner where Nelly shot his first video. And that is kind of this area's claim to fame up until this point, which put them back on the map. Hope I didn't age myself. So around 1:50, they finally get to taking down the police tape. And the way the tape is taken down is they remove the tape closest to the crowd, which you can probably tell by proximity to the officer, first. And so once they do this, inevitably, people rush the street towards the actual scene of the crime, where officers and the SWAT team that was serving the no-knock warrant that right before the shooting are still there. So there's tension, people are yelling back and forth, it looks a little hectic, a little chaotic, but still rather calm, just emotions running, the anger, frustration, confusion, etc. .205, as cops actually begin to retreat, the decision is kind of made through the crowd. So this is all word of mouth. This is not organization, right? There are some members of organizations on scene. There is no organized action at this point. But through word of mouth, there's a collective decision to shut down Page and Walton. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, to occupy the street right in the intersection, take hold of traffic, right, and block both in and out in both directions. Now, Page Boulevard is actually a major kind of way out of the city for those heading back to St. Louis County after workday. It runs straight from downtown, straight out of the city into St. Louis County. And so blocking Page and Walton is not an insignificant act. And as people, the decision is made to shut down, and this continues, and it's kind of, well, what do we do now, right? No arrests have been made. This is a little over an hour later, about an hour, 20 minutes later. Attempts to negotiate, and essentially the way St. Louis has ended up negotiating is they've taken it upon themselves to increase community relations by making black policemen more visible, if nothing else. And so their negotiation of policing is sending a kind of what activists call the Black Cop Council down to talk to them, which usually involves some yelling, a showing of tough love, telling people to get in order, behave, stop blocking the street, etc. Cursing and yelling at protesters, getting them to act right, go home, etc., which failed and inevitably resulted in a few bottles being thrown from the back of the crowd at the officers. But interestingly enough, this isn't actually the moment when things get most tense. And so the SWAT van that is here on site is actually not the worst thing that can happen, and for a number of reasons. But they only begin to make these very targeted arrests, right? So the only arrest made now, they made a first arrest of an elderly gentleman with a heart condition. The second arrest was for the guy who asked why they were arresting the first one. And the third arrest was of somebody with a very clear and well-known in the community to have a history of mental illness, right? So a targeting of pretty much the most vulnerable members of the crowd, right? And those who ended up defending them. And a couple more arrests were attempted, but the crowd yanked and grabbed them back, so the police were not able to take them into custody at that point. And so kind of thinking, if you're able to read the piece, this kind of ounce of prevention strategy that comes into play. So the other delay. So remember, this is 11 in the morning. The times actually end up being important sequentially, but there is a gap. Anyone with an iPhone knows the battery does not last all day. So now we're back. It's 5:45. And we're still in the street, and there's a decision to march, right? And what's the decision? To march down through the gentrified area. So now it's happy hour, so people are out. It's summertime, it's August. They're on the balconies, on the patios, et cetera. And it's to get these demands heard, right? To raise visibility, to let people know there is a problem, there was an injustice, there was a shooting of, he's 18 years old, that occurred just down the street. Get on our side, right? Be aware of this. And so this march through West City was made, and then the decision to shut down Kings Highway. Shutting down Kings Highway would be like the equivalent of shutting down Flatbush Avenue, right? I mean, a significant thoroughfare through the city. So what's interesting is that at this point, there's very little police presence, right? And you see the Mike Mobile in the back, probably one of the more famous cars in America at this point, but and this is actually some random guy, but used with permission, but not a member of any organization, someone who was just kind of on the block that day, right? But police presence at this point is actually very minimal. So we're able to go through, march, shut down Kings Highway. It took about 20 minutes to get through past happy hour. That did not do what I thought it would do. So this is marching, through the gentrified area. And then here to shut down Kings Highway, this intersection. And from here, the fact that there was no police presence at all whatsoever made those who lived in the neighborhood happy, right? Half the crowd felt like it was a victory. The other half said something is wrong, right? Especially those who have been protesting on an almost daily basis for the past year. There's an acknowledgement that only over the course of 2 hours, seeing 2 police cars, one was on lunch in the drive-through, that there's something bigger happening. And so if you assume that perhaps from a theoretical perspective, this lack of police presence means that there's a lack of threat, right? Oh, they're not doing anything, just, shutting down major thoroughfares. Nothing to see here, right? Then this does beg the question as to why police have to come and manage and monitor and quell dissent, right? And calm and quiet social movements at all. If something is threatening, we would think that it's perhaps at least some level of threatening and would require some type of surveillance at all stages and not just as you pick and choose, if that makes sense. And so whether or not, this surveillance is more about quelling the movement, or perhaps there's this order maintenance function as well. And this question was soon answered as to where the cops are. They were busy gathering back at the corner of, this is actually a block up from Walton, Page and Marcus Avenue. And so what you see here is essentially every on-duty officer in St. Louis City lined up, not from, from sidewalk to sidewalk, but from house to house. And from house to house ends up being significant for, things that happen next. From here, they begin to advance forward. The pictures of advancing forward, well, actually, I had some really good pictures of advancing forward, but there were people in them, so I couldn't use them. But from here, they began to advance forward on the crowd, right towards Walton, the original scene where people are still occupying and the majority of protesters are. In doing so, because they are lined house to house, they came across a family and shouting, "Get home, get inside." And the family was shouting back, "We are home, this is our porch." They maced the family, right, parents and children, on the porch of their home, which inevitably made the crowd upset, right? People peacefully standing on their own property being maced. And the children actually ended up having to go to the hospital because of the macing. One had really bad asthma and could not get to breathing properly. And so from here, it's 6:59, and you'll see things escalated extremely quickly, right? So this is the deployment, not of tear gas. Tear gas is actually a bit more pleasant than what this is. So, there is an aspect of innovation. Over the past year, activists learned what to do in response to police. Police learned what to do in response to activists in these protests, et cetera, right? And one of the things that police learned was that when we use tear gas, right, activists are carrying Parmalat. Parmalat neutralizes tear gas. So you pour the milk on your eye, milk is a neutralizer, and then you're kind of not good to go. You're still a little messed up a little bit, but you can carry on and stay on the block. So this is actually CS smoke. It's a military grade agent and chemical weapon. It's much harsher and not able to be neutralized with milk. So as time went on, this is the burning, bless her, but her brand new Prius. This is right down Walton. These were fires set in the middle of the street. And this picture, I love for a number of reasons. And it raises the question, which I'll come to at the end, like what exactly is the role of allies? This is actually a picture the other half of it to the left was an argument. And what the argument and who the argument is actually between are these people, white, not residents in the area. The area is predominantly, and by predominantly, about 99.9% black in the immediate radius, who actually started setting all of the fires. And so residents in the area were upset and stopped them and said, would you come to your neighborhood and begin to set things on fire like this, right? So when you think back to, riots, right, and what's actually occurring, who's responsible for property damage, there's a little bit of a difference between media narrative and both kind of on the ground watching who's responsible, but then also it's kind of a long-running activist joke. If any, Billy Joel, like, we didn't start the fire, so after this there was, the group is RevCom, and they, wrote this blog post that essentially said, well, we didn't start all of the fires, right? So, it's kind of a joke on, a play on that. This is a burning apartment building, so I'm behind it away because it was hot. In addition to the fact it was like 100 degrees in the middle of the night in St. Louis, the building just made it hotter. And the sparks were beginning to fly, so I didn't want to get too close. And so this question, is the policing of these events on August 19th, are they typical, right? Or is it an outlier? And to kind of get at this question, then, I'm going to tell you about the rest of the events over that month of August, so 1 year later. So over that month, there were a total of 3 nonviolent direct actions, and to list what they are, so this is a courthouse action, so if you watch the news, this is where Cornel West was arrested. The shutdown of I-70, which was the most awesome thing to ever watch, probably ever, and the taking of the Justice Center. Commemorative actions, right? So these memorial builds, candlelight vigils, moments of silence, balloon releases, such as what I illustrated for you in the beginning of August 19th, right? How everything kind of started. These various marches and protests, and then public awareness events. And so in total, 39 actions, right? And so particularly public awareness, and maybe kind of like, what's that? So this is 5 trainings, right, on a few things, usually what to do during a nonviolent direct action, right? How to stay nonviolent when your first instinct is fight or flight. How, and in doing so, you may make it that much more dangerous for everybody else that you are with. How to medical trainings, right? So how to respond to bean bags, right? Like what kind of treatment immediately, what you should be wearing. When you're out, they instruct you, do not wear lotion, do not wear anything like that. It is an irritant. And so if you are tear gassed or do come in contact with CS smoke, you will be on fire for hours. And these other screenings, museum things and things of that nature, museum exhibits, art exhibits, things of that nature. And so just because I obviously like pictures, some examples, right, of these nonviolent direct actions. So this was the courthouse action. You'll see Cornel West sitting in the middle. And yeah, my angle not the greatest. Eventually I had to hop back over the fence so that I would not be one of them sitting in jail and I could get the rest of the day, such as the shutdown of I-70. And so essentially I-70 is, and the reason why I-70, right, so people see it as an inconvenience. You're stopping traffic. This was rush hour. It's about 5 o'clock. So people are leaving the city to go back. But I-70 goes over the St. Charles Bridge. The St. Charles Bridge being this symbol to many of white flight and then the, kind of economic deprivation that happens, right? The inequality, representing really the inequality within the region. And so it's very strategically placed. There are a number of highways that they could have chosen, but this, one particular 10-lane highway, which took a significant number of people to shut down, was really for these symbolic purposes, not just to inconvenience drivers on their way home from work. And also, I guess I'll just say that these are your most arrestable actions, right? So there were, like 40-something arrests at the courthouse, 69 people were arrested on the bridge, and it almost didn't matter what you do. Once you came off the bridge, there were more police waiting for protesters there, so there really wasn't escaping it. These commemorative actions, right, the memorial bills, the vigils, the moments of silence. Oh, sorry, I'm pressing the wrong way. There we go. So this is one in front of the Six Star Market where Kajim Powell was killed. Consists of really stuffed animals, loving messages. There's kind of a ceremony that goes into it. Everybody comes and gets together and contributes supplies and material. The infamous Michael Brown Memorial, that's been kind of destroyed and rebuilt a number of times. You'll see where so you can see there's like black pavement and then it goes like light. That's where they repaved because they couldn't get some of the staining and the blood out of the street after he was shot. And so on this site, now that it's clearly marked by the repaving, there's this permanent memorial there that people come on a regular basis and replenish. They cover when it rains, etc. Cars are now known to drive around it. And in fact, Canfield Drive, where he was shot, is not a major thoroughfare. It's actually hard to get out of once you get into the community. These marches, right? So this was a march of about almost 1,000 people onto, so this went to South City, which is another gentrified area, but this was on the anniversary of his death, like that same weekend. These public awareness events, and I kind of made this picture a little smaller, but it is something, a very similar angle as public, but a panel discussion on essentially assessing the problem and really getting at this question of allies that was rather interesting. And so then who are the targets, right? And who are the targets really ties into what are the goals of these various movements. And so state actors, right, your circuit attorneys, your police chiefs, your police unions. Public opinion is another target, right? So we've all seen perhaps the use of social media in both, I don't want to say marketing, that's the wrong word, but in promoting awareness, right? But in also organizing. These art exhibitions, right, that show, there's one, Faces of the Movement, that was a big one on display at the Regional Arts Commission. It's a portrait. The portraits were also a fundraiser to continue the movement. Selling for about $1,000 per photo to make sure that they can stay, because there is this economic aspect to movements and sustenance and persistence. And so in these ways, activism in the greater St. Louis area is really comprehensive, right? It's multifaceted, and fascinating. That's what I was thinking of. That's how that word came out, right? And somewhat very distinct from previous movements that the social movements literature focuses on. And so then what exactly are the tactics used to police these various types of actions? And how can we possibly explain them? And one way is this, threat and weakness perspective. Essentially, as a movement kind of increases threats to your political elites, police become more repressive, right? So this is, somewhat a conflict perspective, that this threat really drives repression. But then also, in terms of weakness, from within and from without, right? If protests lack the capacity to react to this excessive force of repression, some literature, and the jury is kind of out on this, says that police repression will be much more repressive, right, when these movements are weak. But from without, when these protests lack allies, right, people willing to kind of say, hey, what you're doing is wrong, repression will also increase. And there's a small kind of subsect of case studies, which was probably, which is where what I'm talking about today would fall, that suggests that police presence in and of itself, right, and then their subsequent repression and the level and use of force is dependent both upon the threat itself, right, from a political perspective, but also the participants, right, and whether or not these what we sometimes call marginalized or more socioeconomically or politically disadvantaged or disenfranchised groups participate. And so then following Earl and this kind of framework of police action, then what is the type of police response? And first I'll add in there, generally in the movement's literature, these kind of large aggregate analyses of studies, there's always a section, and on average, police don't show up to most protests. In the St. Louis region, that is not the case, at least in terms of observations, but also gathered through media, narratives and reports, et cetera. There is no such thing, at least in this time frame, of an unsurveilled protest, right? So police are always present, police are always watching. And so there are kind of questions and implications as to what exactly that means. And so, not going away from that, police were in attendance at all events. There weren't any without. But, and so often the kind of nothing to see here, at least in some way, was the most common. But because this nothing to see here would then occur at every single event, I pulled it out and not included it, right? Because this calling all cars actually represents a combination of approaches, but then it would skew the representation here, making the calling all cars the most common if I included it in. So I pulled it out. And so calling all cars here are a little bit different than the way Earl defines it. This combination of these other policing strategies only consists of, perhaps do nothing at first and then ounce of prevention, right? Or do nothing and then a Dirty Harry approach, right? This, kind of force-reliant, force-heavy approach to policing. This, and so, this ounce of prevention, then this legal eagle, the use of arrests to quell protests, also very common in driving, this calling all cars. And so what exactly does this look like? And some visually may not look that different from others, because do nothing or the nothing to see here still often looks like a ton of police standing on the street on average, right? So for gatherings, at Florissant are almost nightly, and this is in many ways why there was in the news a few weeks ago, police were being criticized for joking about the issues of arrest-related deaths and protests, saying, I hope they continue because they love the overtime, because it really is a driver of overtime. I mean, from a financial perspective, many police, those who are essentially required, right, to be at every single event, are being significantly compensated for it. And so, there are questions as from a financial perspective, what exactly this hyper surveillance in the region means. This ounce of prevention, so the use of arrests, you'll see the women in this photo, not very clearly, but at that point they, as you go in, you turn, there are these various supports. So just to explain this photo, she's actually shouting her name. It's the fastest way to get out of jail. So people on jail support are standing there, they take the names and they can immediately start working on the bail, or you can stay in for 24 hours and then get released, get ROR'd. It's calling all cars, right? So back to that snapshot of August 19th. Another separate day actually, relying on undercovers or what would usually be undercovers, but plainclothes cops to come in and make targeted arrests. And so then, what are some of these, preliminary findings in terms of, and findings also in terms of, well, what about activists, right? What do they do? And one adaptive, kind of strategy that is relied upon by activists is this idea of leadership without leaders. So that when those targeted arrests are made, right, at the courthouse, when Cornel West is arrested, Reverend Sekou is arrested, when DeRay and Netta are arrested, when, Kayla is arrested, and all these people that you think are leading these organizations are gone, actions still continue, right? So the shutting down of I-70 was the same day that Cornel West was arrested, like 2 hours later. And so targeting who police think are leaders of these movements doesn't actually stop action, right? It doesn't stop protest. Another kind of response or strategy that activists have adopted is geographic mobility. it's easy to police. It's easy to police and control very concentrated geographic areas, right? If you're only focused on one particular place and it's bounded geographically, it's very easy to monitor. And so one way to get around that, to make it harder to be surveilled, is to move. So actions, perhaps in the morning, you're going to gather at the Justice Center in Clayton. Then you're going to move to, downtown St. Louis, right, and protest at, St. Louis Metro PD. Then you're going to go back out to, Ferguson and, protest and act there. Or even if you are in one locale in Ferguson, you're perhaps going to walk and move, right, so that surveillance and monitoring just gets a little bit harder. And given the sometimes sporadic nature of protests and the potential for it to go for long periods of time, so on that one day on the 19th, we were essentially out there from 11 in the morning until 3 in the morning, right? This is worse than 9 to 5, like a job, many times, right? Then if it's long periods of time, if it's across multiple people, multiple places in a day, protests end up being able to function without defined roles in leadership because people begin to assume these jobs of things that just need to get done. It's 100 degrees. People need water, right? People need food. People need rides to get from downtown St. Louis out to protest. And so without someone to sign up, right, without using organizations, people begin to just on the fly do these things, right, which helps keep activism going. It doesn't need to be led by an organization in order to be successful and in order to continue, right? When it's time for an arrestable action to occur, people know, am I arrestable? And thanks to the policing of, the St. Louis area, there are many people who are arrestable, right, that are not eligible for conventional employment because of arrest and felony convictions, et cetera, who quickly step up. I served too. There's one guy, in direct quote, I did 2 years on a carjacking charge. This is a municipal offense. Sure, you could arrest me. I'll be out by tomorrow, right? And so you have those people who are willing to be arrested and identify with the cause so that actions can still continue. You have people who are not arrestable that provide support, right? Jail support is a 24-hour endeavor in St. Louis County that has been running since last August with the sole purpose of supporting activists once they get arrested, right? So that things can continue. And there have been some legal, defeats in terms of what you can do protesting. And so then, these kind of final questions, there's no such thing as an unsurveilled protest. And, what are the kind of implications of that? And, further, arrests are pretty commonplace. They happen all the time. Not only are people arrested often, but these same people are arrested on multiple occasions. And so what is the point of an arrest for protesting, right? The idea is that perhaps if you make these arrests, people will stop, right? The fear of being arrested will make people think twice about shutting down Page and Walton, about shutting down Kings Highway, about occupying a federal courthouse. But if arrests then become commonplace, and the charges, because of the nature of the arrest, right? I mean, you're being arrested as you are exercising your First Amendment rights, right? That is the right to protest. It's a First Amendment right. Then there's almost, perhaps in like criminology, if you've ever had it, like the side effects of common behavior, it doesn't have a deterring effect at all. And so, in fact, forceful policing doesn't quell protests in the region. And this is, I say somewhat, but it's extremely counter to the literature on police force and legal repression, right? The literature says as police get more repressive, people stop protesting, they become afraid, right? Or find it in their best interest to perhaps express their, discontent in other ways. And so then what are some of the implications? And the first is, on the resilience of protesters and activists in response to these policing tactics. And so this, kind of obvious question per se, but I will frame it, would the events of August 19th have occurred in that way without the shooting of Mansour Balbay? Probably not, right? It's this kind of perfect storm of people already gathering on that issue, and then another precipitating event occurs. But prior research also, explains the policing, focusing on threat and these elite political interests. And that may not exactly be accurate as well, which begins to question the role of third parties, right? I mean, some of the literature says that as, police get more repressive, if they're, so this is your, kind of weakness from without, right? Or another way to think about it is strength from without. If there are people on the outside watching this happen and more willing to speak up, that repression should decrease. But after a year of extreme media attention, DOJ monitoring, et cetera, the use of these repressive tactics by police have not decreased, right? And so then perhaps it's not third-party monitoring, right? Perhaps that's not the role. And so then the last, this question of issue perception and questions of issue salience. And what exactly I mean by that is, for this particular situation and in this particular place, it may be a bit more relevant to focus on the qualities, characteristics, and structures, including the interests of law enforcement agencies themselves, than focusing on activists and police. Because doing so would allow you to explain both the institutional and organizational characteristics that perhaps influence the policing of protests, certainly, right? So what is it about department policy that requires so many officers on the scene, regardless of the size of the protests? But also really begin to explain the kind of integral functionality and indispensability of deadly force to the issue of policing. Because no matter how repressive police get, the issue essentially is life and death. And so if you're being repressive but you aren't killing people, right, perhaps it is not enough to stop protests, to stop activism, to stop people from demanding, stop killing us, right? And that's something that the literature, particularly on social movements, completely overlooks, right? So there's a lot of literature on the G8 summit and environmental issues and Occupy, but at the end of the day, the focus of many studies is the expression of rights, right? So the expression of these various constitutional guarantees, perhaps, but nothing so basic as the right to live, which is perhaps the distinguishing factor in these protests, particularly in this region, as opposed to a lot of prior movements that we've seen so far. And so with that, I just want to say thank you. And if you have any questions, and this is my email, but thank you very much. These actions are essentially, they're attended oftentimes by the exact same people. The core activists, but there are many, right? So no leaders in that sense, but it is a collection of the same individuals at these actions over the past year. And so police are very familiar with them as individuals. So after the action at Kiener Plaza, where the balloons were released, and they decided to march to the courthouse is about 2 blocks away. Police were there the entire time monitoring, not blocking off traffic, right? So they provided no services to facilitate the expression of First Amendment rights, but were on the scene at the courthouse as they were making these demands for the release of the officers' names and them to be fired. And there was actually the building where the circuit attorney, Jennifer Joyce, is located. And so they were on scene. Both St. Louis County PD, St. Louis City PD, and there's a federal building across the street, so federal officers were on scene as well. And as all of these officers were on scene, St. Louis City had their radios up so they can, communicate and hear and keep track. And as they did that, so then when things came over the loudspeaker, came through rather urgently, everybody was able to hear. And so almost in tandem, right, activists and police, obviously in their separate vehicles, right, moved from the courthouse downtown to West City, Page and Walton. Does that make sense? Answer your question?
Were they apprehended?
No. So at this point, no. And part of it is political. So this whole time, as their demand, another demand once they got to the courthouse was to meet with Jennifer Joyce, who was busy tweeting about how she was ready to meet with protesters, but wouldn't come down out of her office to actually address and meet with protesters. And so there's this, kind of political kind of play going on as well. But it was rather peaceful, right? I mean, there's signs, there's protests, a megaphone, of course, but nothing that would per se be confrontational. Although there's some in the literature that define confrontational, tactics as, showing up at somebody's place of work. So, I mean, maybe in that aspect, but nothing that would prompt arrest otherwise at that point in time. This is why there's a lot of resentment between activists and political representatives. So, in fact, if anyone is familiar with Antonio French, who kind of gained prominence by being on the scene in Ferguson, he's actually a St. Louis alderman, and this was actually in his territory. And he was there as people first arrived on the scene, but as soon as they started to march through West City, through the gentrified area, he left. And to many, say this is why you can't trust political figures, because even those who have built their entire reputation around the issue, right? He's a St. Louis alderman with his office in Ferguson, not even in the area that he is elected to represent, right? Who has essentially abandoned people who are advocating and protesting the issue that you gained your fame for, right? And he's even one of the only aldermen to show up. There's a school council, a school board member that, comes and has been arrested with everybody else, and, many can't wait to get her out of there, except they don't have the ability to do so for various reasons. But other than that, there's very little political allegiance on the ground of local politicians, which does create this kind of resentment, right? And this kind of hypocrisy and a distrust for the system, right? I mean, and so it's very clear the goals are not, let's vote and elect more people, right? Let's not vote and elect more people, because in fact, who would those people that are supposed to represent you be, right? Many of the representatives are already black, right? So you can't increase representation. You're already somewhat represented in the political process. And so if it's not that, which is our typical response, then what would it be? And so many, especially given the age of many of the activists, many of them are young, but then also there's a kind of gap. Many are young, under 25, many are over 55, right? Who have time to go out every single day and stand up for what they believe in, who carry on traditions, who are active in the civil rights movement and things of that nature. But the turn to politics has never been a clear goal or belief that they advocate for. And a lot of framing, and not just with activism in St. Louis, but also in general around Black Lives Matter, a lot of the critique is that, oh, well, you don't have clear articulable goals. You don't have policy goals, right? Something like body cameras, while sexy, will not solve the problem. And it's not that they don't have goals, it's that it's been decided that the goals that they're articulating are invalid, right? So the demand is basically a change and restructuring of the system where these things wouldn't happen. And so at the end, when I talk about focusing on the institutional and organizational dynamics, what is it about the way things are set up, right, that keeps these issues coming to the forefront? If you change figureheads, if you change, this is kind of a functionalist perspective. The system is kind of self-perpetuating, right? And so changing the people in it will do nothing until you change the system itself. And that's how they expect to make change. That's why they're not looking to the current political process to really answer these questions, that it'll be something that comes from outside, or a complete kind of revamping that will really be true change. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. Well, agree or not, right? I mean, there's always this perspective of like, is that realistic? And, depending on where you fall, the answer. But that is one argument. So it's an extremely good point because, well, for a number of reasons. But one reason is because they've really been under the microscope for the past year, right? And so this kind of 1 year later was really a chance from many perspectives for, kind of police in the area to show that we have gotten better, right? And they showed something, but it wasn't that. And then that, perhaps they've gotten different, but not necessarily better, but what they've, improved upon, or what they have learned, right, from past action, is repression, right? That's where they've grown. The way in which they make arrests, they've moved on from rubber bullets to beanbags. Shooting a rubber bullet, while painful, is not as painful as a beanbag, which is, it sounds kind of harsh to just talk about it so quickly, but right, I mean, so changing the type of less lethal force that they're using, right, changing the type of tear gas, right, or the type of chemical munition that they're using, there's been changes, just not in the direction that everyone thought that they would be going. And so then, it goes back to that why, right, and what it is about it. And that's, kind of where I just want to argue that there's a functional aspect to all of this. There's a functional aspect to the issue that death serves a purpose in policing. Like, it is, I would argue, a useful thing for police to be able to kill people. I'm not arguing that that is correct, but the institution, the way that it is now, being able to kill somebody, right, which is essentially, you have a constitutional right to trial, right? You're innocent before proven guilty. By killing somebody in the course of a police action, you're essentially depriving people of their constitutional rights. It's not how we frame it legally as it goes through court, but being able to kill people with the law on your side, right, the presumption that pretty much it'll be justified, has a functional purpose in the ability of police to control populations and do their job. And so only looking at that will really begin to understand, and really make change in terms of, what getting better and different. Because if the institutional goals are the same, right, it's only the means to preserve those goals that changes, then perhaps we're not going to see the change we want to see.
No other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you so much, Portia.
Thank you.